So for the last 8 years, I've been living in and out of Białystok, or a small village outside of Białystok, Poland, in the Podlasie region of eastern Poland, which is right at the Belarusian border, but also was a historically this crossing point of all. It was a center between all these different cultures: Lithuania, Belarus, Russia, Germany, Poland, Ukraine. It was and Jewish culture, Romani culture, and Tatar culture. So it was always this kind of melting pot of different kind of elements. And this is also where the language Esperanto came from, because there was all this kind of volatile differences of cultures that were there. And it was an attempt by Ludwig Zamenhof to try to bring these to find a common tongue, a common language. But Białystok for a long was also one of the kind of, in the 19th century, it became the second largest kind of center of textile production in this region. It was there and Łódź in Poland. And these became also places of where some of the earliest kind of elements of kind of industrialization and work and worker rights was being kind of developed. Kind of early kind of forms of industrial capitalism, and that as being gendered and racialized was very much at work in this kind of place. And so at the turn of the century, because there was all these different minorities, it was something like 70% Jewish as well, which were all types of different Jewish elements that had immigrated from Ukraine and had been in the area for long times. And at the beginning of the 20th century, there was all these kind of early socialist and all types of different kind of worker movements and labor movements and communal movements. There was the Jewish Labor Bund, which was hugely influential. Also, many of the kind of early parts of Zionism also was coming from this region. But you also had like the Polish Social Revolutionary Party was also like very much centered there. Białystok at the turn of the century was at the fringes, the periphery of the western periphery of the Russian Empire. And during this time, it was always a kind of volatile kind of place, and it had developed this kind of politicization. And a number of people from this region had traveled to Switzerland and to Geneva and some other places, and had returned with kind of early anarchist literature, and were hugely influenced by people like Mikhail Bakunin and these kind of early Russian anarchists that was being developed. And between 1903 and 1908, pretty much all of the kind of anarchist movement, which was massive, was kind of centered in Białystok, in the world, and was hugely influential to other places, particularly to Ukraine and to the first Russian Revolution, but as well as in Poland and around the world. I mean, one should not forget that lots of other anarchists had come from this area, including Emma Goldman from Kaunas. So this was always a kind of mixture of different kind of political affiliations. But between 1903 and 1908, it became a kind of powder keg. Białystok became a kind of powder keg of revolutionary energy, and the main kind of group that was bringing a lot of them together was a very radical insurrectionist anarchist group that were called the Black Banner. Cherno Znamie. Excuse my poor Russian. But these groups were often talked about in terms of anarchist history as kind of the first kind of active propagandists of the deed. They really believed in doing violent insurrection, and even in like they saw the necessity in political movements for like catalyzing actions, for deeds rather than words. And for many of the people who were part of this were kind of uneducated Polish and Jewish youth, but also like uneducated female Belarusian and Polish textile workers. And so this became a kind of like radical kind of movement that were really against politics as such. Their interest was not in having manifestos of words, even though they did do lots of kind of printing activities, but they believed in actions, and the way that they did this was through expropriations from the rich, and not just from the factory owners and landlords, but of targeting the entire kind of upper class that was enslaving everybody. They did general strikes. This is also a main place where they were unifying these kind of general strikes, and they were actively fighting the police and the Russian military that were circulating around, and also in conflict with all these other kind of revolutionary movements that were happening. Pretty much everybody this kind of movement came from people being kind of tired of the kind of the normal kind of political organizing as it was being practiced at the time in all these different socialist and anarchist and more conservative movements that were happening in this region. So the Black Banner like started this kind of massive attacks on these people, and kind of catalyzed this like very, very kind of active kind of event of political activity by kind of antagonizing the powers that be, and kind of reversing the logic of violence, of state violence, and of violence committed through subjugation as workers. And we're trying to kind of like reverse that direction of violence as it was being practiced there. And in one of the only kind of publications that they did, they had a motto that was I'm gonna say this incorrectly, but it was a Goethe quote, and it was, "In the beginning was the deed." So it was from Faust, of like, it wasn't the word that initiated action, it was the deed. And their thought was this kind of like radical acts of catalyzing the masses by any means necessary, in that sense. And this was a very active kind of moment, and radicalized kind of the entire city. There was at the time it was the largest general strike that had ever been practiced. Also, they were going after very specific factory owners and other things. And they were occupying areas within the city. So the street that's Surovska Street, ulica Surovska now was called Surovskaya. So yeah, Surovskaya Street. And what it was a kind of a no man's land where the police and others were not able to come in there because it was protected. And you could see this type of kind of radical insurrectionist urbanism, certainly in lots of places in the Middle East, but also in places like Athens or Lisbon and Porto, that had also these kind of pockets of energy that the police did not have power. All of a sudden, power was being reversed. So this type of activity also has a kind of it has some very problematic consequences. One of the members of the Black Banner, or a follower of the Black Banner, like a young 15-year-old boy in Krinky, which is a small city near that used to be quite a bit larger, that's at the Belarusian and Polish border. And he was at a synagogue. It was during the Yom Kippur, the high holidays of the Jewish New Year, and after many kind of skirmishes with the police, this guy had decided to go after the kind of new new leader of the police, the commissioner, the chief of the police, as he was leaving the synagogue in Krinky, and murdered him. And that was one of the kind of that was a kind of powder keg that like blew up the kind of activity. And then the Russians started bringing in these kind of military and other kind of organized gangs to like join into this kind of fight. And what they were having also like in Białystok, there was also a lot of kind of fights around kind of Polish identity at the time. And they had the Catholic Church had finally gotten permission to do a full-on mass procession through the center of Białystok. But they did this. It was encouraged as a counter movement to another massive labor strike that was happening simultaneous with this. And when these two factions converged, there was quite a bit of violence that came out of this. And because of this, these type of actions, and because the Black Banner were identified with were used as an excuse to victimize the Jewish populace, particularly the urban class that was right in this kind of center area. They this initiated what became known as the Białystok pogroms, which I think killed like 80 something people and injured 80 kind of people, but also became a kind of huge movement. This was all happening simultaneous with what was the Łódź insurrection, which was a early socialist or communist fight in the beginning of kind of Polish political history, but because of like all of the kind of socialists and anarchists around Europe were watching all of these kind of events that were happening, and it became super inspiring. So then new Black Banner factions started popping up in Grodno, because Grodno was very close, in Minsk, in Vilnius, in Odessa, in as far as Baku. I mean, and also were a number of the people, after having to leave this area, went through Minsk and then went to Moscow and to St. Petersburg. And so this became a kind of radical rallying cry that was part of many of the different kind of factions that started the first Russian Revolution in 1906, right? 1905? Yeah.
Sorry, cut.
Yeah.
All right.
So I've been looking into this kind of history, partially because I'm living in Białystok, and certainly because of the politics of what is happening in Poland and all the kind of but also in the context of all these popular movements that are happening around the world. And often when protests would happen, there's always this condemnation of looting, condemnation of quote unquote violence, of direct action, and these other types of actions. And I think that much of the discourse around protest movements and radical action has been really diminished by creating a kind of prohibition of say, nonviolence. As nonviolence is always a way of kind of measuring people's kind of political sympathies. At the same time, this is almost always a misinterpretation of heroes like Martin Luther King, in terms of he wasn't saying like non-antagonistic action. He was just saying like not falling into kind of militaristic war and violence. So I've been thinking about the problems of the world today and the way that certain popular movements have blown up at different times. One should remember that the Arab Spring, which happened 10 years ago, was started by a pissed off guy who lit himself on fire. He was in Tunisia, and he was completely fed up. And that catalyst, that kind of deed, became a kind of catalyst for lots of other actions. And one of the things that made, like, say, the Arab Spring so difficult was because of different countries' state violence that would be then enacted, and this is how we got the destabilization of so many of these different countries. And you can see that the role of state violence to also, like, catalyze the people and to radicalize the people has been heavily important. From an American standpoint, also with, like, the Black Lives Matter movement is also a recognition of this. But also in Chile and other places, these kind of popular movements have been also coming from the violence that is being done onto women through the controlling of their bodies, the subjugation of their lives and their labor. So there's been there's been a lot of kind of popular movements that have happened in the last years that have been very much about channeling energy and rechanneling the kind of violence and trauma that is put onto people, and speaking out in a kind of very direct, extreme kind of world, which is so trying to think about what are these kind of tactics that the Black Banner and others were kind of exploring, and how were those kind of working within the these different systems, and so, like, this project that I've been working on in Białystok is called In the Beginning Was the Deed, and this project has been about trying to both remap Białystok, or this kind of Grodno, Vilno government kind of area, and remap this kind of place that is at the meeting place of all these different borders and cultural identities, and try to remap its kind of political history, and trying to emphasize this type of kind of very kind of global influence through a kind of local and politicized identities. And trying to use that as a way to kind of think about the state of protest today and the state of violence from the right and from the left, and how these are practiced in many different ways, and trying to use it as a way to think about cultural practices and collective practices that could happen in Poland in particular, but the world in general, trying to create solidarity. While I was working on this kind of research project with the plan to develop it towards an art exhibition and a series of kind of publications, I started collaborating with a curator, Katarzyna Wozniak, in Białystok, who had just moved there, but had come also from thinking about collective and political kind of cultural practices. And so we started trying to develop a kind of reading group and research kind of group in the development of what will become an exhibition, but is hopefully also going to become a kind of way of dealing with this information, trying to tell this story and try to apply it to the kind of political circumstances, and use this as a way that we could do trainings and bring people together who would otherwise not be talking to each other, and finding kind of like taking from the legacy of the Black Banner and trying to think about how this can be applied, if at all, and whether or not art is the right tool in which to do this type of practice. While we were working on this project, earlier in 2020, there was a kind of raid that arrested a number of anarchist organizers in Italy, France, and Spain. And it was organized by the Italian government, and it was called Operazione Białystok. And the reason why they called it Białystok was because these members had been circulating a translation of a book that was talking about the history of Białystok. It's biographical information and a number of first-person accounts that were talking about the Black Banner and the history of this. And it had I'm not sure where the original source of it is. Some of it, I've seen some of these texts or similar stories in other resources, but essentially it was translated and produced in a Spanish prison, and then brought to Italy and translated also in a prison through these anarchist organizers, who were being accused of. There's some videos circulating that they had bomb making equipment, and that they were throwing bombs at banks. They were very much against hurting people, but were very much aligned with a number of these extreme anarchist movements that are happening in Italy and Spain and Catalan in particular at the moment. So it just so happened that while working on this project, they get arrested and are being persecuted for distributing the same story that we have the intention of distributing through Operazione Białystok. So this kind of coincidence also becomes necessary, and particularly in Poland, where there right now is a massive kind of boom of the necessity, the need for political practices, and particularly from artists. What has been coined as post-artistic practices has become very much part of the way that artists are thinking at the moment, and it may be responding to the kind of politically volatile conditions of Poland right now, which is going after women's rights, but also LGBT rights and migration right, immigrant rights, but also Poland, like everywhere else, is also becoming aware of the problems of kind of the economies in which we are functioning in our kind of late capitalist society. So this is very much trying to look at that kind of necessity and powder keg of kind of political activity, and look at it through this kind of historical story that's been very little known, and that has been circulated through kind of anarchist reading rooms and libraries and archives for 100 years, but that hasn't really been brought out as a fundamental part of particularly this kind of region's political history. So trying to kind of offer this while also apply it, and and not just talking about it, but doing it. This entire concept of in the beginning was the deed. So trying to also implement some real actions alongside some more representational or allied kind of practices.